On today's episode of Hungry for Wisdom, Jesus' second coming might actually be like his 16th coming or something. Yeah, that sounds doctrinally solid.
What?
God says no to being a passive-aggressive jerk face, and when Jesus said turn the other cheek, he actually meant shoot your enemies in the face with a concealed Kimber 1911. Marka! It's episode 46. Turn it up! Welcome to Hungry for Wisdom. This is the podcast for people who want to know what God knows. He hasn't told us everything, but man, he has told us a lot. I'm Dustin, pastor at Grace and Truth. If you want to know what God knows, let's dig in. Episode 46 is dedicated to my neighbors, all but one of them. And the reason for that is because I've got some great neighbors, man. Everybody on my street, they're awesome. I go outside, doesn't matter which one of my neighbors I see. I like these guys, man. So, all but one of them. So this episode, I hope you guys listen to it at some point if you are masochistic enough to do so, because I think you guys get enough of me probably just on the block. But I love living next to you guys. I love our block parties. I love 4th of July when we all get out there and grill and blow stuff up. I love you guys, all but one of you. All right, so for our daily dose is the Greek and Hebrew ministry out of I was watching that this morning. I was doing daily dose of Aramaic actually. This morning. Yeah. Which isn't daily. They only release it on like Mondays and Thursdays. But I guess daily dose is just too catchy to pass up. So
Yeah,
bi-weekly dose or semi-weekly dose of Aramaic doesn't really do it.
that totally makes sense.
Yeah, but anyway, we're in Proverbs 3. Check it, yo.
Here we go.
Proverbs 3, verse 29. My dog Solomon says, "Do not devise harm against your neighbor while he lives securely beside you." All right, basic principle, bad neighbors ruin everything. I love my neighbors. I just told you guys that. My whole street is full of super nice people. I got one exception that's a little ways off. No problem. I'm not bitter at all. You can tell. Our buddies across the street, they moved away, and we were just praying for good neighbors because when your driveways face each other, you see each other a lot, right? So anyway, the new guys moved in, and they're awesome. God said yes to our request. It was like a huge relief, right? So because when you have a bad neighbor, and I'm talking like an aggressively bad neighbor, let's just call him Jesse the jerk face, because Jesse can be a gender-neutral name, right? So it could be guy Jesse, gal Jesse. You got Jesse the jerk face. We'll go with a guy. So when Jesse lives across from you or next to you or behind you or whatever, it makes it so that home is no longer a place of rest, at least in some degree, right? Like it robs you of Angeti in some measure. You pull into your driveway, you see Jesse the jerk face mowing the lawn, and you start to feel defensive or offensive, or you wonder if you're going to have to talk to him and put up with his nonsense, that kind of thing. And then something actually jumps off, right? You get into like a fence line dispute, or you got to argue over an easement or something like that. Jesse drags you into court, which that happens a lot, man. And I've always thought, like, who wins in that situation, right? You go to court, and all of a sudden now home is the battleground. That's just terrible. And so then you go inside after dealing with Jesse, and he's still in your head, right? Or she's still in your head. You spend dinner time ranting about how you're mad and you're not discipling your family. It's just awful. So Solomon's point, don't be a jerk face. Be a good neighbor. Be the neighbor that people want. Bake some cookies. Invite people over for s'mores. Swap some recipes. Yes, all of these references have to do with food, because I find that's actually the best way to reach out to neighbors and get to know people. We're culinary beings, man. We bond over food. Christians break bread together. Non-Christians form experiences around the table. It's just what happens. So we've got some neighbors. We've got some neighbors that they're not Christians, and they're living a lifestyle that God just flat out says no to. And they know where we stand, right? We've tried to share the gospel with them, and they shut us down pretty hard. They're like, nah, we're good. We're good. Like, shh, we're done. Quiet. But they can cook, dude. They can't pray, but they can cook. And who doesn't like some food, right? So my wife ends up swapping recipes with them. And every now and then, she's cooking, or they do, and whoever's cooking will make a little extra, run it across the street to the other one's house and ask for feedback. It's like, hey, try this. What do you think? And it's like, oh, that's amazing. Can I have the recipe? So my wife figured it out, man. It's like, we want to be good neighbors because it's Christ-like and for no other reason. But there are actually a lot of other reasons and fringe benefits, right? I mean, like Luke 6:35, it says that he himself is kind to ungrateful and evil men, right? So we all commit evil in our lives, and yet God shows us grace, and we can be Christ-like in doing that. Don't judge your neighbor, love your neighbor. And so the second half of the verse is instructive. Well, it's a hint. It's subtle. right? It says, do not devise harm against your neighbor when he lives securely beside you. So the assumption here is that he's living securely beside you. He's at peace. He's doing his thing, right? So don't be that guy that like eats your way into the mind of his frustrated neighbor when he walks into his house, right? You want him to be able to live at peace, and you don't have the right to disturb him in that. God is not giving us the right to occupy space in somebody else's mind when we're not welcome to. So it's pretty simple. Be a good neighbor. Don't be Jesse the jerk face. Can I get an amen?
A to the men.
What up, Pastor Ben, Bearded Beaver? Good to see you, bro.
Good to be here.
All right, man. We got some pastoral questions for our This Is and That's this time. Are they on this paper? Yep. I was going to wrinkle that paper up. Now I'm not going to.
All right. Thank you for that, sir.
Yeah, and I think I was doing some copy-paste action. I didn't really look at them much, but pretty much straight-up Bible questions, which is great because we love the Bible. But how much trouble are we getting in today?
It doesn't look too difficult.
All right.
It looks great. These are awesome, good, genuine questions.
Solid. Let's do it.
All right. So just a heads up again, if you have questions, you can get them to us. You can email your questions to office@graceandtruthcommunity.com.
It's long, but it's simple.
Or you can send them to @GTMicropastor, and that will be on the Twitters.
Yeah, and I check that at least twice a year, so they will get through.
About the same amount of time that I check my voicemails.
Yeah, leave a voicemail for Pastor Ben.
Have you ever noticed that though? Like how we used to like check our voicemails all the time, and now it's like, I think the iPhone just totally broke it for me because I just never checked them after I could see who was calling me.
I am happy to get to voicemails as soon as I know that they're there. The problem is I miss them a lot of times. For some reason, voicemails just don't weigh heavily on my mind, so I forget to check them at the end of the day or something. I miss the call. I see it in the call log. Boom, I'll call the person back, and they're like, oh, did you get my message? And I'm like, oh, yeah, sorry, I forgot to check. Because in the missions world too, right? You got all these different apps you got to communicate with. So I've got phone calls and text messages, and then I got WhatsApp, which I hate so very, very much. And then I got Signal, and you got Teams and FaceTime messages and Facebook Messenger, and different people around the world use all these different ones, right? And for some reason, voicemail. So I got 95 different communication mechanisms that I'm using between that and email and whatever. And then for some reason, voicemail just doesn't make my list.
Oh, so what the worst is when they leave a voice message in the text, or when they text you a voice message like via like Messenger.
Right. So they just
messages.
like hit a recording and then send that to you?
Yeah. So you can't. So you get this message thinking, oh, I can read this and respond rather quickly.
Yeah.
Instead, you have to play it and listen to it.
Yeah.
And especially if it's in a foreign language.
It's a different language, right? I've gotten those in Portuguese before. I'm like, what do you expect me to do with this?
Yeah.
And yeah, so I get that a lot, man, with my people in Latin America. They'll send me voicemails or voice messages on WhatsApp, and it's in Spanish, which is fine as long as they're speaking clearly. But when they mumble and there's background noise, I'm like, dude, we're planning logistics, and it's like, hey, you got to get on the plane at this time. Like, you can't be mumbling that stuff. I want that in writing.
Nope. Exactly.
Yeah. So leave us a voicemail with some questions. We'll get them eventually.
Yeah, one of these days. Yeah. All right, so this is a question from Carl. Carl says, Jesus came in the Christophanies and then came back after the resurrection. So why do we refer to his birth as the first coming and his return as the second coming? Hasn't there been a lot of comings?
That's a really insightful question.
Yeah.
All right, so let's break that down a little bit. There was some theology talk in there. So Christophanies it's a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. So Jesus was born in the New Testament Gospels. It shows us the events around his birth, and that was in, let's say, 0 AD. I think it was actually like 4 BC or something. Like Jesus was born 4 years before Christ. They adjusted the calendar because they realized they made a mistake. But let's just be simple about it. We'll call it 0 AD or 0 BC or something, the year 0. All right, so that's when Jesus shows up in human form, right? But in the Old Testament, you get all these places where God shows up and wrestles with Jacob, or God shows up and negotiates with Abraham, or God, the back of God is seen by Moses, and, Joshua interacts with this dude and stuff like that. So, and it turns out that's God. So these are called theophanies, which is God being manifestly and like physically and visibly present. And to be more specific, if a theophany is God showing up, and to be more specific, a Christophany is Christ showing up before he was born, before the incarnation. So if you've got Christophanies, Jesus already came to earth. So why is his birth the first coming. And then he dies. He raised from the, and he said what? He said he came back after his resurrection.
Yes, he came. So he came and then came back after the resurrection.
I'm going to assume that's he rose again and then walked around and talked to a few hundred people and stuff like that. Otherwise, this guy's a Jehovah's Witness that thinks Jesus came back in like 1914 or whatever it was.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, let's say we're talking to a Christian here. Okay, cool. So he rose from the dead and he's back, right? When he was in the grave, his body was in the grave. We know he was off doing all sorts of stuff, declaring victory to the souls in prison and so on, but he's back. So that's like another coming right there. So how many comings of Christ are there actually? Okay. So why do we call the birth of Jesus the first coming, if there were some before, and the return of Christ the second coming, if there have been other ones between the first and the second? Okay, at least one other one. All right. Good question. You got an answer to that?
Well,
I'm stumped. I'm out. I quit.
Yeah, right. I think there's a couple things here. First off, again, the pre-incarnate appearances of God the Son, right? Those Christophanies. I think that would be where he has appeared, but he was not directly answering the promises of that he was not directly being the answer to the promises that through your seed all nations will be blessed, that there is the greater king, that the promise that God makes to David. He's not fulfilling all of the messianic prophecies, right? The advent of the complete fulfilling of the messianic prophecies would be the first advent, the first coming of Christ.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to go with it. Is we're not talking about every time somebody can see him with their eyes. We're talking about like Genesis 3:15, right?
Yep.
Like, hey, there's going to be a baby boy, a human, that shows up and kicks Satan's butt.
Yep.
Or more accurately, his head.
Crushing it.
Well, since he's a butthead, I guess that's the same thing. 7th grade joke? Yeah,
yes,
up top.
Really good.
White guy high five. So we're looking for a very specific event, and it's when Jesus comes to beat Satan. Boom. That was it. In the birth and the incarnation, that was the first coming. And then his whole life and ministry and work on the cross and resurrection, that's all the first coming of Christ. Maybe not the first time he showed up, but it was the first time within his mission that he had shown up to do exactly what Genesis 3 and Isaiah 9 and all these other prophecies said he was going to do. And then the second coming is the rest.
Yes. When he comes to set up that, if you're a premillennial, then he sets up that premillennial kingdom and reigns for 1,000 years. And if you're not, then that's when he comes back and still reigns for a long time.
Long time.
But
which according to the amillennialists, as he currently is. So,
that is true. So it's really
we should do some. No, we shouldn't. Not today.
Not today.
No, not today, Satan.
No, but one of these days, maybe we should have a good. So, Carl, that's where we're at with that. And again, good question.
Really good question.
All right. So, is it angel or angel?
Your call, dude. I made it up. So.
I'm going angel.
I try to conceal people's names sometimes, unless they're like, "Hey, I really don't mind my name getting used." Then it's like, okay, but.
Well, I'll go with angel, and the reason is because our tongues. Known languages or heavenly languages.
Well, yeah. I had a great uncle who was Swedish, and he called Swedish the heavenly language. So in that case, it would be both.
All my friends in Mexico say that Spanish is the heavenly language.
It's certainly not. I can speak from experience, and neither is English, by the way. English is a horrendous language.
Oh yes, that I will agree with.
Yeah, we just crossed 1 billion words. Well, this is like 5 or 6 years ago. We crossed 1 billion words in English now.
That makes my head hurt and my heart sad.
Yeah, and
especially given a lot of those words are probably ones that we really don't even want.
Yeah, we don't need them. Well, and the reason is because one of the reasons is because so much innovation has happened in the U.S. that all the technological terms are in the English dictionary. Medical innovation, even though most of them are based on Latin, they all came from English-speaking people. They're in the dictionary, and so you get that, and then words like refrigerator. Well, that word didn't exist. It came into existence at some point. So you combine all of this stuff, we are up over 1 billion words. Plus, English hyphenates like crazy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
like the Germans, they just slam words together.
So obviously English is not the heavenly language. And
we've established this.
We would assume we've now we've now ticked off half of the hemisphere because Spanish, obviously, isn't.
Hey, it's a fine trade language.
It's an excellent trade language.
No. Yeah. Did you ever read that Mark Twain essay called "The Awful German Language"?
No.
It is hilarious. He takes the German language and just rips it apart. It's literally called The Awful German Language, and he delivered it as a lecture.
One of my kids actually took German in high school.
Yeah.
He actually still remembers it. Like
why? Look, everybody in Germany speaks English. Why are we still messing around with this awful language?
Yeah, I don't know.
It's horrible. Okay. Yeah. So, are tongues heavenly languages or known languages? I don't actually know if you and I agree on this.
This might be fun.
All right, roll up your sleeves, bro. We're going to fight.
Man.
All right, so I'm going to go with this. I've got two boxes in my head to, boy, I really should have prepped this answer. I got two boxes in my head to operate in, okay? One is missions, and one is prayer. Now, I think that tongues in the book of Acts, especially in like chapter 2, where you first see it and things like that. Well, I guess that is the place in Acts where you see it. These were known languages. They were communicating in each other's languages, right? Now, if somebody is gifted in the area of tongues, which I'm not a cessationist, so I'm going to go ahead and say that still happens, right? If somebody is gifted in the area of tongues, then my first thought is, okay, who are you communicating with whose language you have never learned, right? Because I don't want somebody coming out here, shit about a Honda, about a Yamaha, and then saying they got a gift, and I'm like, no, you've got very loose lips. Like, if you're looking in the Bible, then we're talking known languages most of the time, except there is this passage in 1 Corinthians 14. Is that where you're looking?
Yep.
You are, okay. There's a passage in 1 Corinthians 14 which talks about the tongues of angels and the tongues of men, right? And then Paul says, I speak in tongues, or I pray in tongues, speak or pray, I forget, more than all of you. Now, I don't see any examples in Scripture of Paul speaking in languages that he was not previously exposed to. You see him speaking in Hebrew, but he knew Hebrew. You see him communicating in Greek and writing in Greek, but he knew Greek, obviously, because he said, see with what large letters I write with my own hands to the Galatians in Greek. So when he says, I speak in tongues or I pray in tongues, regardless of which one it is, I don't remember, then I'm assuming he's talking about that, praying in the languages of angels and men. And the alternative explanation to that is it's got to be a hyperbolic statement where he's saying, look, even if you speak in tongues so much that you're speaking in languages that aren't even earthly, right? Like, let's just go there rhetorically for a moment. I think that's a bit of a stretch. That puts a strain on the text to say this is hyperbole. He's referring to something that doesn't actually exist for the sake of making a point rhetorically. It's possible, but it seems like a much more straightforward explanation to say he's talking about something that he claims that he is doing. So I do think that if somebody, I think that when I see, I'll give you an example. We got a couple of people here that are old Pentecostals. I don't know how they wound up at our church, but they're a couple of old Pentecostals. And I have been at their house before, and I'll knock on the door and, one of them will come to the door, say, yeah, come on in. She'll be in a minute. She's in the other room praying. And I walk past and I see her and she's, praying quietly, kind of whispering to her, not to herself. She's praying to God. And there's stuff going on with her lips that I can tell she's praying in tongues. Now, I don't have a problem with that. If that were happening in the congregation, I would say somebody needs to interpret this or else it's unhelpful and it needs to, wait. But theologically, I've got a space in my head for that. I would say she's gifted in an area of prayer that she's got a toy that I would love to play with. I don't own that toy, but I don't think that she is operating outside of the will of God in that. So yeah, I've got a category for both if I'm understanding the scriptures correctly.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the first category.
I think everybody agrees with that one.
I think that is there. The second one, I honestly to this point, I've not experienced that, and so most of my experience with tongues has been in a different, probably a little bit more of the chaotic version of that. Now,
which is normally where you see it, right? Because it's like when it's done properly, it's done quietly. And that's the point of 1 Corinthians 14.
Yeah.
Most of the time, you're not going to see it. And so when you do see it, it's usually exhibitionism.
Yeah. And this is just and you can even teach me on some of this. As I'm looking at the passage here, it really does seem that I don't want to say that Paul is mixing terms, but he says, desire the spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy. So he says, hey, desire the ones that, even including that you may prophesy. But then he puts this for statement in here: for one who speaks in a tongue speaks not to men but God. And so is there a connection there between the speaking in tongues and prophecy? Because it seems to be that those two words seem to be being used almost interchangeably. In that,
greater is one who prophesies than the one who speaks in tongues, unless he translates. So that
there we go.
Verse,
See,
what verse are you in?
I was in 14, 14:1.
Yep,
and then the connecting statement in verse 2.
In verse 2. Okay,
Yeah,
so for one who speaks in a tongue does not speak to men but to God. So that tells me these are not the languages of men.
Yeah.
And if they are, if I'm praying in English or I'm praying in Swahili, why does God care? We're talking to God here. This is not human communication we're dealing with.
That is true.
So that would be, look, if my man, Johnny Mac, if John MacArthur was in here and heard me say that, he would assault me physically.
Blow a gasket, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
That would be the end of his ministry.
Have you not read his Strange Fire?
And by the way, I read Strange Fire and I loved it. It was a great book. I disagreed with the chapter on cessationism.
Yeah.
And when I disagree with a guy that smart, I get nervous. So there's a high probability I'm wrong. But when I'm looking at the text, I'm seeing stuff like that. I do see a category for heavenly languages.
Yeah. And what's interesting here, and this has been, and I will tell you my personal experience is that I don't know if you want to call it preaching or if you want to call it tongues. When I do speak Spanish from time to time, and when I am sharing the gospel or preaching in Spanish, my Spanish is by far better than when I'm just trying to order food at a Mexican restaurant.
Yeah, and who would refute that the Holy Spirit helps us along in our ministry and in our weaknesses, right?
Yeah.
My Spanish isn't that good. Wow, it was really good today. I had the same experience in French. I've spent 6 weeks just learning French well enough to get around in West Africa because the guy that spoke French wasn't going to be there. I wound up translating for the whole team as we needed it. That doesn't mean I was good at it. It just means it got done.
Yeah.
And it was done beyond my ability. Okay.
Yeah, and so to be fair, as far as a diligent study of 2 Corinthians 14 is not something. 1 Corinthians 14 has not necessarily been something that I've dedicated a whole lot of time and effort to. So that's probably that needs to go on the to-do list.
Yeah, there you go. Now I've the challenge is set forth. Have fun. And if I'm wrong, let me know. Push me.
Sweet.
You're my pastor, bro. I'll take it.
I'll take that.
What else we got?
Okay, so question number 3, and this is from Patty, the potential pacifist. Should Christians carry guns? It seems weird for someone showing the love of Christ to always walk around ready to kill someone.
That's such a great way to put that question.
I know. That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, Patty, the potential pacifist, has clearly never been a man before because we're always ready to kill someone. Right? No? Okay. Yeah, good question. So, should Christians carry guns? Okay, preliminary question here. Do you think it's possible to answer this question outside of our positions as citizens? Do you think it's possible to separate our citizenship on earth from our Christianity on this one? I wonder, because I'm thinking through my answer, and I've answered this question many times for people, and as I'm evaluating my own answer before I say it, I'm thinking, that's a pretty typical American answer, though.
Well, I mean,
I'll tell you what. Let's go. Yeah. Let's do this. I'll throw my answer out there, and then you can shred it and tell me if I'm reading the Bible through the lens of my culture.
Sounds good.
Okay. So, first off, I don't think the Bible has a lot to say about this, right?
Especially since firearms were not invented in the first century.
Yeah. Well, so like so many things, I go back to if it's true, it's got to be true everywhere, all over the world. As far as like a biblical case. So if it doesn't work for the pastors in the African bush, it doesn't work here either, right? Culturally and applicationally and stuff, there's all those conversations. But when I go to Kenya, I've worked with the Maasai tribe over there, and they carry around clubs, the Maasai war clubs. And part of that is just cultural And part of it really is that they pride themselves on being a warlike people, right? In other words, you don't mess with us. Now, they almost never get in a fight, but part of the reason for that is because if people show up and try to fight them, they're going to get a club in the head. So
a well-armed society is a polite society?
Yeah, and it seems to be the case, over there. But I would suspect that people that object to Christians, I would suspect that Christians that object to concealed carry would not have the same objections about a Maasai war club, right? Because we have been conditioned that guns are this separate thing.
Yes.
Right? Like that whole thing, guns kill people.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, when it's sitting on a shelf, it doesn't. It's in somebody's hand. So Jesus told some people to carry around swords. That's where people always go, right? Well, Luke 22, he said, make sure you got some swords. And I'm like, listen, I am an American. I love me some Second Amendment. Do not use that passage. Okay. He wasn't saying, hey, be ready to kill somebody, because right after that, Peter takes out his sword and he slices off Malchus's ear, and Jesus is like, knock that off, put it away. What he was doing was he was saying, let's make sure we're set up for the prophecies that are about to get fulfilled, the miracles that I'm about to do, and the work on the cross. And so he was making sure that these guys had all their stuff available. Now, that being said, he clearly wasn't anti-carrying the sword either, because he told them to do it. Not for the sake of being ready to kill somebody, but for the sake of his particular mission. But the fact is they already had two, So the disciples were running around carrying some swords, and for 3.5 years, Jesus didn't seem to see fit to stop them. So for me, with that very little information that we have, right? We got how he seems to not have discussed it. So it's an argument from silence, which is not a strong argument. Mm-hmm. But if that's all we got to see what we can do with it. We've got how Jesus seems to not have discussed it, how to approved of it for a reason that none of us are ever going to live through. So there's not really a connection there. I would say this is an area of conscience, not an area of biblical law. Okay. Now, walking around being ready to kill somebody, I would say that's a heart condition. That's a problem, right? Let's change the phrase. What if you're walking around ready to stop somebody from killing somebody, right? What if you're walking around ready to save somebody? Because when cops walk around with guns, their motto is protect and serve, right? So in some sense, an offense is their defense. Does that mindset transfer to the citizen? Now, I've seen two arguments that I can sympathize with here. I fall on one side, not the other. The more pacifist argument was Romans 13 gives the power of the sword, the power to take life, to the government. So a duly sworn in police officer with a badge and a uniform and a gun, or a soldier, or whatever, these particularly lined out governmental agencies have the right to walk around ready to kill somebody. Average Joe citizen does not. And then the other side of that was, yeah, but that's true if you're only looking at Romans 13. The other side is natural law, where you take a look at Exodus and it's like, all right, you got to defend your property. Well, was it light enough to tell that the person was there to rob you or not? If not, you're in the clear. If so, you may have some culpability here. So Exodus wrestles with natural law and taking a life a lot more than Romans does. And I think that if you take all of that into consideration, the case to be made is we have a right to protect things, as seen by the fact that Mama Bear mode exists and that Papa Bear mode exists. And since parents have that urge within them and are made in the image of God, then, whatever. And I fall on that side of things, because if a father, if his children are being threatened, or if his wife is being threatened or something like that, and he doesn't have a gun and he still kills somebody with his bare hands, nobody's going to squawk about that. So I think we get caught up in the gun because we've got a Marxist culture that tells us we should be scared of guns. So all that to say, here's where I'm landing on the thing. I think that if a Christian wants to carry a gun and can do so in good conscience and responsibly with the right heart condition, then there's no rule against it in the Bible. And I do think generally, now I'm putting on my citizen political hat for sure. An armed citizenry is a safe citizenry. I think the Japanese didn't do a land invasion in 1941, and they went for Pearl Harbor because they couldn't stand against an instant army of 120 million people, all with guns, right? It worked. So I'm like, the deterrent factor seems legitimate to me. So anyway. Yeah,
I there's not many holes that I would poke into that. I I think that we have those rights enumerated to us by the Constitution. So as citizens of the United States, we have those rights.
Oh, so you're saying that the Romans 13 thing, it says, hey, like, go with the law. Well, the law says we're delegating this defense thing to you guys in some measure. That's an interesting thing.
That wasn't necessarily that. I was just saying that we actually have the right, so it's granted to us by law. I wasn't necessarily going with that we're also then part of that well-regulated militia or whatever. Because I from a constitutional standpoint, I actually I don't want to get into those weeds, but really to say no, this is a right afforded to us by the tradition and history of the Constitution over the last 200 years. So we're not violating Romans 13 by having that. And where the law permits, we are given freedom. Now, as far as, again, I like what you said. If I'm looking around trying to kill somebody, then there's a bigger problem.
Yeah, I don't want that guy carrying a fork, let alone a gun.
Exactly. But the interesting thing is that as speaking to those, knowing of those who were who have their own concealed carry, when they walk into a situation, there's two things that I know go through the mind. There's probably a bunch more. One, I am armed, and if this situation calls for it, I'm going to have to use it because I can't let this thing get out, right? Secondly, how do I de-escalate the situation so that I don't have to do it if I have that opportunity? That's the one thing that I have found to be consistent when I've spoken with folks who are concealed carry. It's not like they're just going, okay, great, I feel empowered and I'm ready to rock.
Yeah.
This is actually a big responsibility.
Yeah, and you get that knucklehead every now and then that open carries just because he wants to see people open carry in the grocery store or see people. He wants people to see him open carry in the grocery store. That dude's a moron. Know, it's like, dude, who do you think they're going to go for first? Come on, give me a break. But yeah, that's machismo. But there is a weight and a responsibility to it to say, because if you have if you have the ability to take a life, you also have the responsibility to save one if the opportunity arises, right?
Absolutely.
So it's what I tell my kids about becoming adults. Like, you don't get to drive past a potentially fatal car accident where nobody's stopping anymore.
Yeah.
When you're an adult, you stop and help.
Yeah. So there's a lot of nuances. I know that, for example, I believe it was Pastor John Piper didn't want to have guns in his home because if someone were to come in, he would rather lay down his life as he's attempting to share the gospel with someone versus take their life potentially as they may not know the gospel and now all of a sudden they're condemned to hell. Yeah. And I get that. I don't. But I can appreciate it.
I can't.
I'm sure you can't. But hey, that's a stance that he takes. Yeah. I don't take that personally. I think that me protecting my home, in particular protecting my wife and my children, that's what God has given me. And
yeah,
and that is that's not to speak ill of those who are pacifists or anything like that. That's not a stance that I took, and that's one that I can necessarily. I don't want to lay that on anybody's conscience. First of all, again, if I believe that God is sovereign over salvation, then. then
somebody should introduce John Piper to Calvinism.
Okay. Yeah.
I remember hearing him lay that argument down, and I thought to myself, there's a big gaping hole there, which is general revelation, right? And general revelation says there's a protective hierarchy in the home that exists for a reason. I mean, there's a reason that no man, if he hears the door jiggle downstairs, is going to tell his wife to go and check it out, right? Yeah. Like, there's a reason for that. And I understand, believe me, I'm a missionary. I understand that people's souls are more important than my continued heartbeat, and I know where I'm going and all of that. But if I don't protect the garden from evil, I'm doing the same thing as Adam, right? And I just thought, like, when I heard him saying all of that, because there was, and this may be a different, I don't know if you read it or whatever. I saw a clip where it was like a pastor Q&A, and they said, if somebody broke into your house, would you kill him? And he kind of paused and he goes, probably, I guess, in a certain circumstance. And I'm thinking, dude, you got responsibilities of your family. You should think through this stuff before it happens, because you're not going to be able to make the decisions in the moment. You know what I mean? Now, I got all the respect and love in the world for John Piper. I'm picking on this one answer. I don't want, but is with my brotherly disagreement there is there's a lot of information in the Bible and in nature that you have to overlook to emphasize the one point of the preciousness of that person's soul. And there is such a thing as a death-worthy offense.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it, according to, natural law.
Now, I will say this is me putting on my citizen hat.
Okay.
And is that in the past, we have actually, it would seem to me that at least, for a long time, our safety as citizens was something that we took for granted. And now I'm beginning to question that. I think you can pretty much ask any shop owner in San Francisco, Seattle, or Los Angeles, even Portland, as to whether or not they're safe. Or even the idea that if I'm encountering a situation with somebody at my house, how long is it going to take for me to make sure that my place is safe versus wait for a police officer to arrive? Yeah. Love our police officers. I think they deserve all the respect in the world. But can I depend upon that person to arrive within the 30 seconds that I would be in the most immediate danger of someone busts into my place?
And they would tell you
gun.
That.
Yeah,
they would say, I can't get to your house that quick.
Yeah, so in that instance, I would say I think for me as a responsible citizen to have the means to protect myself, provided I can do so in a way that, again, cares for my neighbors. I'm thinking about our neighbors. Like if I'm picking particular calibers that I know aren't going to go through 12 things of sheetrock. I'm not going to pull up my deer hunting rifle as I go out if someone comes into my house, right? Yeah. I want to pick something that will have stopping power, but that won't go. And this is off the rails.
No, we're learning here. Go ahead.
But man. I want something. This was something I thought about when I was in California, because it was like I want something that has stopping power, but will not puncture a wall and harm my neighbor who has a child or something like
theological that. Principle. You should never be able to ask a robber, do you feel lucky?
Yeah, I mean, this is the most powerful handgun in the world. Yeah.
Now, okay, here's a related question. How powerful of a squirt gun are you allowed to have in California?
Oh, well, they banned Super Soakers because they had plastic, the Prop 65.
They banned Super Soakers?
Didn't. I was totally joking. But
you know what? I was almost surprised by that for a second. I was just like, California. I saw a bike from California with a license plate on it. It was like a necessary, like a stamped, licensed license plate.
Now, was it possible that was one of those like gas pedal or electric?
This one wasn't. No, it was like I got it at a garage sale here, and I'm just like, why is there a California approved ID like this? I don't know, man.
I don't pretend to know. I do not know anything about. I have done my best to forget everything I know about California politics. Sorry, guys, for those of my friends in California, but yeah.
Okay, so is it okay? The question then is: it okay for a Christian to carry a gun? My answer, I'm seeing if our answers are the same because we covered a lot of ground here. Yep. So my answer is, according to your conscience, with the right heart condition, if the values line up with God's values, then yes. Like there are circumstances where yes. And there are circumstances where no, it would not be okay for you to do this. But broad spectrum, I don't see a prohibition against an American Christian concealing.
Yeah, I would say that. I think even knowing yourself, and maybe even somebody else might say, you with a gun might not be a smart move. I wouldn't hand my 13-year-old the keys to my car. He's so if that were the case, I say no. I think maybe some training needs to get involved there. At least you need to know how to safely handle it and all that kind of stuff. But part of that again comes under our heart condition. This is something, sword or not, this is something that can do harm and do damage, and I want to make sure that I'm taking all the right steps to not have it, hurt someone when I don't intend it to.
Yeah. The one. I guess there's two cases for Christian pacifism that I've heard before. And I have a lot of respect for one, and I don't have any respect for the other. The one is the one that I laid out there, which is, hey, Romans 13 says this is for duly appointed government agencies, right? I get that. I sympathize with it. The one that I don't like is, Jesus says turn the other cheek, man. Like, Jesus was a pacifist. Like, yeah, give me a break. I don't like that one because that's just yanking whatever scriptures you feel like might support your case in order to say, well, I just pulled the Jesus card so you can't argue with that or else you're anti-Jesus. It's like, in fact, I think about, I believe it's Mark 8 where he sees the Roman centurion. Matthew 8. He sees the Roman centurion, and he, basically converts him, right? Heals the kid, does all of that. Never once tells him to leave the leave the military. The Roman army was doing horrible things,
yeah,
right? And he's like, "All right, see you later." The guy went to work on Monday, So I think it's I think it's bad to retroactively impose 21st century values on these guys and pretending that they would answer questions in a certain way that they had never even thought of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That the idea that you can take not only that, but maybe even a 21st century idea of who Jesus is that may have been read through things like maybe the Jesus movement or others where he was, everybody was saying, "Oh, Jesus was just this hippie, this peace-loving dude." Okay. I mean, obviously
there were elements.
There were elements of that. He did sit down an entire whatever cohort of troops or the temple guard when they disrespected his name. When they were coming to arrest him to fulfill the Father's plan, they all fell backwards.
Yeah. Well, and I find that more with David and Moses and these guys. Like, these are war crimes. It's like these guys hadn't read the Geneva Convention. Right? Yeah. They were operating in a very specific context. Was everything they did awesome? No, but let's just understand history. It's nuanced. We should do a whole episode on historical revisionism.
Oh, anachronism and all that stuff.
Yeah, man.
Man, we get in all kinds of great trouble.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions?
We are done with our questions.
We're done?
Yeah.
This episode is only 41 minutes.
Wow, that's a record.
That's like the intro to one of my sermons. That's amazing. Well, I don't know. I think in the last 41 minutes since we started, the world is still a messed up place.
Amen.
But, I don't think anything has changed in the last 41 minutes, that we have a gospel that is perfectly suited to fix it.
Oh, amen.
Hey, all right, guys, let's share the episode with anybody that you think it might upset. And go ahead and give us a 5-star rating if you haven't already. If you think we've earned it, and hit follow. That'll help us out, and that funds the mission for the World Hope Bible Institute. Until then, we'll see you in episode 48.
Hungry for Wisdom is a ministry of Grace and Truth Community in West Richland, Washington. You can find out more about us on our app, social media, or at graceandtruthcommunity.com. We love Him because He first loved us.